You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Yi. I'm a human capital researcher at the Conference Board. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Insights. It's a podcast series brought to you by the Conference Board. Sitting with me today are Laura Septini, who's a principal researcher in the Human Capital Center, and also Amanda Popiola, who's also a human capital researcher at the Conference Board. So Laura, Amanda, and I, along with Dr. Jing Horan, who is based in Asia, we recently co-authored a report titled What's Next for Employee Groups. So without further ado, let's get to the issue at hand with our two experts on this subject. I'm sure some of our audience already have some questions after hearing the title of a report. So let's start with you, Laura. So why do we choose the term employee groups versus a more common phrase such as employee resource groups, affinity groups, or business resource groups?
Yes, thank you, Amy, and hello, everyone. Yes, so in this study, we wanted to find a name for the groups that would be a little broader than employee resource groups or business resource groups. As we know, many organizations may use different names interchangeably, and there's not a consistent way of defining the groups across all organizations. And so we wanted to have a general term that would comprise a lot of different examples of groups, as we said. And we also wanted to make sure that there was a distinction between employee groups, the way we define them, and more informal workplace groups and gatherings.
Great, thank you, Laura. So can you talk a bit more about how we define employee groups in our study, and what prompted us to do this study on this topic?
Yes, so we defined employee groups as any type of volunteer, employee-led, company-recognized entity formed to act as a resource to both employees and the organization. And this dual function of the groups is really key for our definition. Many listening probably know that typically employee groups are formed around shared characteristics such as background demographics. It could be gender, race, ethnicity, nationality. Some groups may be organized around work-life stages like working parents or early career professionals. And more, as we'll discuss later, we can find groups organized around interests, can be around a job function, of volunteering, sustainability, and so on. So the impetus for this study was exactly that, try to understand how employee groups are evolving and what is next for employee groups. We know that many of these initiatives started a while ago. They've been in place in some organizations since the 60s. And so how are these kind of initiatives expanding or evolving? Interestingly, the impetus for this study came from the perception that maybe organizations are moving away from employee groups as we know them and focusing on other D&I initiatives or focusing more broadly on inclusion. And so we wanted to explore if that was the case. To do so, we conducted a survey. This was a survey where we asked executives in 92 organizations, and these were leaders that had responsibilities related to employee groups and diversity and inclusion strategy. And we asked them about their initiatives and their global initiatives in regards to employee groups. We surveyed 92 organizations globally again, and then we did some follow-up interviews. These were in-depth interviews with leaders, again, responsible for the groups. And this was to get some nuances about their experiences, understand the challenges and opportunities that they saw, and get also some qualitative data that we could use to help understand and interpret our survey findings. So what we found, without giving too much away from what we're going to discuss during the rest of the podcast, is that employee groups are actually still very relevant today. We saw a very substantial increase in interest in groups and across different global regions. we asked survey participants to tell us both the kind of interest that they've noticed in employees joining employee groups as members. But also we asked them about whether they noticed interest in employees across the organization to participate in activities that were sponsored or organized by employee groups. And in both cases, organizations in our sample really very strongly told us that there had been an increase in interest. And as we'll discuss also in a bit as we go over the findings in more detail, is that while there are new types of groups emerging and the strategy and the structure of groups are evolving, but oftentimes these are being added to and supporting more traditional types of groups. So a lot of really interesting insights came out from our analysis.
Thank you very much, Laura, for the very thorough explanation. So it's great to hear that just mentioned employee groups are actually still relevant today. A very popular interest in employee groups is growing. So I'm sure our audience is also interested in how organizations encountered any challenges when managing these employee groups. And what are they?
Yes. So we did ask in our survey about the top 3 challenges that organizations are facing when it comes to their employee groups. And interestingly, again, we had some, thoughts about what we might find. We expected, for example, people to talk about funding or how the groups, things related to practical issues. But actually what emerged is that some of the challenges that we saw in our sample are similar to what you can find in other research that has been done on this topic before. So I'll talk about 3 things specifically. One is keeping the momentum of the groups. It is basically about keeping engagement, keeping people interested in joining the groups and in doing work within the groups. And that was definitely the top challenge that many of our respondents mentioned. As people and employees move around the organizations or leave the organizations. And so you can have, for example, a very passionate and engaged employee group leader. And how do you maintain, sustain that interest and that engagement should that leader leave or rotate out of a particular role? So that was the top challenge. Companies also told us that they had challenges figuring out how to best align employee group activities with their business strategy and business activities. So that's a really ideal situation for most groups to have that strong connection. It helps with sustainability and visibility for the groups. But maybe the practical ways of doing that is still a challenge, and we'll discuss that in a bit. The last area is around measurement and ROI. So we found consistently that companies are still not measuring or finding the best way to measure the impact of their groups. Most respondents do track membership and participation, though we were surprised to see that about 20% don't do that consistently across regions. But a lot more, about 60% of our respondents don't go beyond that. So they don't measure, for example, the impact. And that could be, to give you an example, so are you comparing group members and non-group members on engagement? Or are you looking to see if employee group members are more likely to advance to particular roles or leadership opportunities? So many companies are having trouble doing that. And not surprisingly, a 4th challenge that came up is also measuring the ROI of inclusion. Of course, the 2 things are connected. If you're not measuring the impact, you cannot calculate the ROI, the return on investment of these groups.
Wow, 60% of respondents don't track impact of employee groups. That's really surprising to me. Yeah, thank you for explaining the challenges. So as many of you already have known that the title of our report is What is Next for Employee Groups? So now let's shift our gears a bit to focus on how employee groups are evolving. So in this research, we identified 3 major trends. Laura has just shared the first trend, which is interest in employee groups is still strong and continuing to grow globally. So now let's hear more about the second trend. Amanda, do you want to speak to the second trend?
Sure. So the second trend is about how employee groups are evolving to respond to workforce shifts in companies. So this includes new groups evolving to reflect new generations. So part of this is the millennial generation. About a quarter of respondents to our survey said that they do have groups focused on generational diversity. But I think this is anecdotal. It wasn't really in our survey, but more groups are focusing on the generational diversity than one specific generation. So I thought that was pretty interesting to see how can we bring generations together and how can we have them work together, look at kind of the differences, but also the similarities there. There were also new groups focused on life stage, which Laura mentioned, so groups for new parents, those close to retirement, mid-career workers, so there were all kinds of groups focused on the life stage. And other kinds of diversity as well. So, for example, groups for women in STEM or for creative workers was kind of an interesting one. In addition to looking at different types of diversity and maybe new groups of employees that are in organizations, we also saw groups aligned with new interests. So not just about the diversity of the workers, but interest diversity. Things like social change, the environment, and those kind of movements. So organizations are kind of shifting in the way that they're thinking about these employee groups and what the focus areas can be, and it's broader than maybe it was in the past. So some organizations are also shifting in how they do work towards flatter organization structures, increased teamwork. They're creating more opportunities for collaboration, and that's being reflected in these groups as well. So we're seeing more virtual options, some completely virtual groups, so working across regions, geographies, different organization structures. And we're also seeing remote participation options in those groups as well. So in general, groups are evolving towards the new generations that are entering the workplace and the ways that workers are now requiring availability to participate.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda, for sharing the interesting examples. The gender diversity. And I remember when I was doing the study, I remember a cosmetic company shared they launched a creative ERG to just help spark innovation among their employees about their products. So that really fascinated me. So thank you for sharing these examples. So I think at this point in our program, we're going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back just in a minute and to continue discussing the latest trends on what's next for employee groups.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello again, Laura and Amanda, and thanks for taking the time to discuss the future trends of employee groups identified from our research. So now, welcome to the second half of our podcast. So before the break, we talked about the increasing participation in employee groups and how groups are evolving to meet the different and changing employee needs. So this third trend is actually related to one of the challenges that Laura just talked about. It's about sustaining the employee interest and keeping the momentum of the employee groups. So this third trend is particularly focused on how organizations address these issues and sustain employee interest engagement. So I think in general, from our study, we found that organizations and existing groups are actually striving really hard to foster inclusion both across and beyond the groups, For example, they include remote and virtual workers. They engage allies as well as those employees who may not be working at the head offices, but actually from smaller offices in different regions. So in most organizations that we studied, employee groups actually open to anyone who's interested in joining the groups, attending events or participating in group activities, for example, as a way for them to learn more about their interest and focus areas. I'd say most the D&I leaders we spoke with actually report that they have their employee group events were open to all the employees, and some of them actually even also invited contractors, seasonal workers, or family members of employee groups to participate in some events. So most organizations also encourage employees to join more than one group if they have the availability.
Yes, and to add, of course, this is Laura. We also see that many companies try to find a way to host fairs or either employee group fairs or D&I fairs where the group participate in a substantial way, and conferences. So give the opportunity for multiple groups to work together, either collaborate for the event or just meet and discuss best practices, challenges, success that they had in different things. And this was, again, a way for organizations to increase the visibility on the group, for the groups and inform employees who might be interested in joining, as Amy said, but also as a way to connect in person. As you mentioned, sometimes employees may meet with their groups, on occasion, but there's also remote workers or workers that may come from offices that are maybe dispersed in different regions that would have the opportunity to meet with others and sort of get excited about the activities and the work that they're doing. I also wanted to mention that we heard that several companies that have even awards to encourage, sort of employee groups to achieve their goals and get visibility. And this is a way to definitely increase competition among the groups, but also I think it's a way to increase that interest and engagement from team members. So we heard a lot of great examples from that.
Yeah, and another way that some of these groups are increasing the collaboration, we've heard organizations that are actually creating inclusive groups themselves. So groups that don't focus on a specific characteristic, but are really across all employees. So, for example, one organization had a focus on engineers, I think in February. They had cultural diversity was in May, LGBTQ was in June. So just different focuses for each month, and that way it included everybody. This provided flexibility so they could tailor the groups and the focus, depending on what was important at that time. And they could also focus it locally. So kind of have different focus areas for different months at a more local level and shift over time. We also heard one organization that hosted some events during each month. So looking at 5K runs and lunch and learns and volunteer activities. And so just different events that kind of brought different people together at different times throughout the year.
So organizations are really making efforts to engage and attract employees and workers to different employee groups. So in addition to the open membership structure, as well as the multi-focus employee group model that Amanda just talked about, employee groups actually are also engaging allies by encouraging them to join the groups, participate in events, or even encourage them to become the leaders or co-leaders of the groups. Men, for example, they are often the allies in gender inclusion efforts. For some other employee groups such as disability or LGBTQ+. So in those groups, the number of employees who identify themselves with affinity, especially at one specific location, tends to be small. So allies and employees who feel a strong connection to this issue, usually because they have a family member with disability or they have friends who are LGBTQ. So allies and employees feel strong connection often make up the majority of the group membership.
Yes, definitely. And we find, we've been conducting more research on diversity and inclusion, and allyship is definitely a topic that emerges in a lot of the discussions we have about diversity and inclusion in general, but definitely was key when looking at trends for employee resource groups. That's a challenge that had emerged before, that organizations don't want the groups to feel isolated from the rest of the population. But also, it's a way to make sure that everyone at the company participates in creating more inclusive work environments. It's a way to dispel, if you will, some of the myths that might be out there about what employee groups do, and also, a way to share the opportunity to really build better work environment. Inclusion should be everyone's responsibility. And so by encouraging allies to join the groups and help with the strategy, that's one way of doing that. And as you mentioned, Amy, allyship seems to be evolving across different groups. But it seems to be especially salient for some groups. And as you mentioned, the disability networks and LGBTQ networks often really rely on allies to contribute in a meaningful way and to really provide the opportunity for the groups to function and work across the organization. So definitely we heard that loud and clear in many of our interviews. In fact, one of the companies we interviewed even change the name of the employee groups to add allies. So they had LGBTQ plus and allies as the title of their employee group to make sure that everybody really understood that was a key element of their strategy.
Yeah, definitely allyship is really important for employee groups' participation, engagement. So last but not least, in this trend, we also found some organizations are developing practices to engage workers who traditionally have not had opportunity to participate in employee group activities, such as for hourly workers and remote workers. For example, we heard from a financial service company based in Asia. They actually invited contractors to their employee group events. So on the one hand, it's an opportunity for the contractors to expand their network and also increase their profile among the current employees. And on the other hand, it's organization's opportunity to build a pipeline for full-time employment. We also heard from a multinational food company based in Europe. So they have a lot of factory plants across different regions. And they recognize that their factory workers were not able to participate in employee group events or activities just because the issue of discretionary time. Mm-hmm. So they discussed and they decided to allocate training hours for factory workers so that they have time, maybe like 1 or 2 hours a month to participate in employee group activities and events. Yeah. So I thought that was really innovative.
Yeah, those are very great examples and creative way to make sure that everybody has the option to try to participate in these groups.
Definitely. Yeah, so now that we have shared the 3 key trends of employee groups with our audience, I hope you found them interesting and resonating. So if you want to learn more about these trends, please check out our report, which is available on the Conference Board website. So now let's discuss some recommendations for companies to take if they're looking to renew their employee group strategy or trying to improve the effectiveness of their employee group initiatives. So what are some suggestions for different companies? Laura, Amanda?
Yes. So our report presents a series of recommendations that we gathered from our interviews and from the literature we reviewed when we worked on this study. And the first one is probably not surprising and not new, but I think it's very relevant. And it is making sure that there is a strong business case for why employee groups are important to both employees and the organization. Again, this is a recommendation that applies to many D&I initiatives, but in this case, it's important because we found that many leaders we spoke to actually held the groups accountable for making this connection up front as a condition to join a group. So let's say that if you had someone that was interested in starting a new group or starting a new chapter, in their application, they would be asked to make sure there was a connection with the business. And this helps with sustainability of the groups because, again, they're supporting the business, but also it helps employees that are parts of the group better understand their organization and their business. So again, the first recommendation we had is to articulate a strong business case for the employee groups and why they can be very important tools for the organization.
Yeah, and I would say another recommendation that we have in the report is about engaging all of the stakeholders. So talking to multiple stakeholders. And we see that the benefits for employees themselves. So employee groups can provide emerging leaders with some leadership opportunities and some unique experiences kind of for leaders at all levels that they might not otherwise get. And we also know that executive sponsors and having senior leaders in these groups can give them a pulse of employees. So what is the employee sentiment? What are the things that they need? What are some experiences that they need to have? And what are they interested in? So there's kind of the benefits from the two sides there, but it's also important to engage other leaders, allies, like we talked about, looking at different business units, functions, different regions, and be creative about how you can involve these multiple groups. Community members is another one, how you can involve these groups and kind of bring people together through employee groups.
Definitely. And I know this, Laura has discussed this in earlier when she was talking about the challenges, but I just want to reiterate the importance of measuring effectiveness of employee groups. As we know that people usually measure what we treasure. So if we track how groups are doing and how employees and organizations actually benefiting from establishing and participating in these groups actually really sends a strong message across the entire organization. We encourage organizations to identify metrics early and as the groups evolve, continue to adjust how you measure the results. And Laura mentioned earlier as well, find different ways to compare members and non-members on key people metrics, such as engagement, retention, and also career progressions. When it comes to measuring impact, organizations should look at metrics, but not only for the short term, but also for the long term. So I know we only have 2 minutes left, but I have a question. I'm really curious to hear the thoughts from both of you. So what surprised you most from this research study?
Yeah, so this is a little bit repeating, your related to your last recommendation, Amy. I would say that definitely the number of organizations in our study who are not tracking measures of employee groups consistently surprised me quite a bit. And everybody we spoke with was very passionate about their employee groups, and many organizations are investing a lot of time and resources, both staff time and leaders' times. And so we know that they're valuing, but there's a gap, I guess, into trying to figure out how to really measure things consistently, because often it was an issue of having measures that would apply across different businesses, groups, and regions. So as I mentioned earlier, almost 20% of our respondents don't even track membership or participation. And this can be to, sometimes it's privacy, sometimes it's culture, but more importantly, about 60% of respondents did not track the impact, as you said. And so, again, this is an important area of opportunity. It's one of our recommendations, but it's also what surprised me the most, I guess, as we were reviewing the findings.
Yeah, just very quickly, I also found that really surprising. And I think the other thing for me was that there are so many things that were new to me, but that are kind of normal in organizations today. So having the virtual options, having these kind of multiple faceted groups, bringing in people from different regions, and there's more going on in employee groups than kind of traditionally how you think of them. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I found it fascinating when I heard that the organization had a virtual ERG for the mental health group. So that was really interesting. And I think for me, it was one of the challenges. Actually, number one challenge was keeping employee group momentum. I was not surprised to see that aligning employee groups with business priorities and measuring results to be at the top. But I know that employee interest is strong, so I didn't expect that keeping the momentum would take so much effort from organizations. So that said, I found that really amazed by the different and innovative approaches by organizations to sustain and engage the interest of employee groups. Okay, great. So unfortunately, our time is up for today. I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and a big thank you to Laura and Amanda for sharing the insights on this important topic, which I think is not only relevant to D&I, but also relevant to other HR functional areas. And I hope you have enjoyed our podcast today. And if you would like to find out more information, please visit our website at tcb.org/podcasts or webcasts for more interactive programs. You can also find our podcasts on other platforms like iTunes or Spotify. Thanks again, and goodbye.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.